Every year, somewhere in Quebec, someone grabs a phone because the bear in the yard is wrong. Too big, the wrong color, a hump riding high on the shoulder that the black bears here simply do not have. The size, one caller swears, of a small horse. And every year, a wildlife biologist writes it down and files it the way this whole field has filed it for 100 years, under mistake. Because everyone knows there are no grizzly bears in eastern Canada. Every range map ends far to the west. Every textbook agrees. And that agreement turns out to be the single most interesting thing in this entire story, because the Canadian government keeps a file on the eastern grizzly too. It just happens to read like a death certificate. If the kind of question that sits in that folder is your kind of question, take 2 seconds and subscribe. It honestly helps the channel. And tell me down in the comments which stretch of country you're watching from tonight. Now let's get into it. That is the trap the title walks you into. It asks, what is hunting the grizzly bears of Quebec, out in the woods that run north and east of a city like Montreal? And it hands you a picture of a predator, something with teeth, something out in the dark doing the hunting. But the word hunting is about to change its meaning on you. And the second answer is the one nobody believes. The thing hunting grizzlies out of Quebec has no teeth, no body, and no way to be stopped. It is winning right now, tonight, and it has never once touched a bear. To get to it though, we have to start with the bears that were here, because something did hunt them. It hunted them completely, out of a territory the size of a country, and it left behind almost nothing. A few worn objects in museum drawers. A great many voices no one wanted to hear. Start with the voices, because they came first and they were ignored the longest. Long before any scientists would put the words grizzly and Quebec in the same sentence, the Innu and the Inuit of the north already had a name for it. They spoke of a large, solitary, yellowish-brown bear, bigger than the black bears they knew, a bear you gave room to. It walked the country along the great rivers of the interior, the George, the Koksoak, the Kaniapiskau, and up into the gray stone of the Torngat Mountains. It was not a rumor to the people who lived there. It was an animal you might meet, with habits you learned and taught your children. Outsiders heard these accounts for generations, and outsiders, almost without exception, set them aside. An elder describing a bear his grandfather had hunted was treated as a story, folklore, color and memory, not evidence. The people closest to the animal were the people least believed about it, and hold on to that because it is going to repeat until it finally breaks. And there was one scientist in particular who would stake part of his name on insisting all of it was a mistake. Writing as late as the 1980s, he argued flatly that no true Ungava grizzly had ever existed, allowing at most that some lone bear might once have wandered east and confused everybody. Remember him, he matters more at the end of this than he does right now, because the people were not the only ones telling us. The written record was there too, sitting in plain sight, waiting 400 years for anyone to take it seriously. Go back to 1550 to a French cartographer named Pierre de Sellier, drawing one of the great maps of the New World. On the northern part of the Labrador Peninsula, in the empty country that would one day be called Ungava, he inked 3 bears. Not decorations scattered at random, bears set on the exact ground where the Innu said the yellow-brown bear walked. 2 centuries later, a Labrador trader named George Cartwright sat down with his journal, as traders did, and described the bears of the coast. Among them, he recorded markings that matched no black bear and read cleanly as a young grizzly, a map from the 1500s, a trader's notebook, company ledgers that would later surface recording brown bear hunts along the Ungava rivers across the middle of the 1800s. Every one of them real, every one filed under nothing. And it would take a thing none of them could be, a thing that could not be argued with, to finally force the question. In the summer of 1975, it came out of the ground. An anthropologist named Stephen Cox was digging through an old Inuit midden, a refuse heap on Okak on the Labrador coast. He was not looking for a bear. He was excavating an 18th century site, sifting the layers people leave behind. And out of that 200-year-old ground came a skull, small, nearly whole. A clean cranium and a scatter of molars. Cox did what a careful scientist does. He read the wear on the teeth, the slow grinding that records an animal's whole life. And the wear told him this was no cub and no black bear. It was a full-grown female grizzly, a small one, buried in sediment older than the country she was found in, roughly 2,000 kilometers east of any place a grizzly was allowed to be. Sit with that for a second, because it is the hinge the whole story turns on. This was not a sighting that could be a trick of the light. It was not a story that could be a mistranslation. It was bone. It went into the scientific record, documented plainly, and later a second study gathered still more of the same kind of evidence out of the archives, further proof of a bear the maps swore had never lived there. The skull did not care about the consensus. It could not be waved off as folklore, or as a large black bear on a bad slope. It simply sat there being true. And with it, everything else changed weight. The oral history stopped being stories and became testimony. The old map stopped being decoration. The trader's journal stopped being a curiosity. It was never that 100 voices had each been slightly wrong. It was that every voice had been right and no one had been listening. Notice what actually had to happen for the truth to land, because this is where the scientist who said none of it was real earns his place in the story. It was not enough for people to see the animal. Generations saw it. It was not enough to describe it, map it, hunt it, and write it down. All of that was done and all of it was set aside. The record only turned when a discipline that trusts nothing without a specimen in hand finally held a specimen in hand. That was the whole state of the argument at the time, not whether the evidence was strong, whether the evidence was even allowed to count. And the man who insisted the bear had never existed was not being reckless. He was being ordinary. He was doing exactly what the standard told him to do, which was to treat a mountain of testimony as nothing until a piece of bone made it something. The uncomfortable part is how close that standard came to erasing a real animal from history entirely. Because look at the cruel mechanics underneath it. A grizzly on the Ungava Barrens was already rare, already thin on the ground, already easy to shoot. Every animal killed was one less that could ever become a bone in a museum drawer. And the people who lived alongside the bear had a practice that, without meaning to, erased the very proof science would later demand. When they took an animal, they used it completely. Meat, hide, sinew, bone, all of it consumed or turned to use. Nothing left to weather into a specimen for a researcher a century later. So the physical evidence was vanishingly rare not by accident, but by the way the whole system worked. What survived was the story, and the story was precisely the thing the record refused to accept. The bear was disappearing, and the proof of the bear was disappearing with it, and both were happening quietly, decade over decade, while the official position remained that there had never been anything there to disappear. Which brings us at last to the question in the title, and to the first time the word hunting turns over in your hands. What hunted these bears? What took a grizzly population out of the whole eastern third of a continent? Reach for the obvious answer, a predator, something bigger and hungrier, and you reach for nothing, because on that ground the grizzly had no natural enemy. It sat at the top. Nothing hunted it in the way you are picturing. What hunted it was a market. Those company ledgers recording brown bear hunts across the middle of the 1800s are not a curiosity anymore. They are a murder weapon with the receipts attached. For those decades, every large animal in the eastern subarctic was walking money. And the eastern grizzly walked into that economy already carrying two fatal disadvantages. Its numbers were low to begin with, because that cold, spare country of forest edge and open tundra was never going to feed many great bears per square mile. And it was cut off, with no reservoir of grizzlies anywhere behind it to replace what was taken. A small population, spread thin, steadily thinned by the rifle, with nothing coming up from behind. You do not need a mystery beast to end a bear like that. You need a market, a gun, and time. By the early 1900s, the sightings were already slowing. By the 1940s, they had all but stopped. The last documented one falls in 1948. The bears that walked out of that decade never walked back in. We are halfway in, and if you are still here, you want the real answer, not the comfortable one. Because the comfortable one is that this is a sad story about the past. It is about to come apart in your hands. First though, the paperwork finally caught up to the graveyard. In May of 2012, Canada's Committee on Endangered Wildlife formally split the country's grizzly bears into two groups. One was the western population, the animals of British Columbia and Alberta and the northern territories, still very much alive, around 26,000 of them ranging across a quarter of the country. The other was the Ungava population, the grizzlies of northern Quebec and Labrador. Its assessment was a single word: extinct. Read the sequence and let it land because it is genuinely strange. The same government, in the same document, on the same day, officially recognized that the eastern grizzly had existed and officially confirmed that it was gone. It took the discovery of that skull and a lifetime of ignored testimony behind it to earn the animal a place in the record. And the place it earned was a headstone. The bear was admitted into science and buried in science with one stroke of the same pen. You would think that is the end. The animal is real, the animal is gone, we know who did it and why. Except this is the point where the story quietly gets worse and where it stops being about the past, because the country that killed the Ungava grizzly is still there. It did not burn down. It did not get paved over. The George River still runs to the sea. The Torngat Mountains still stand gray against the sky. The berry crops still ripen in their season. The caribou herds have crashed and swelled and crashed again, but there is still prey moving across that land. If you took a grizzly from the western range tomorrow and set it down on the Ungava Barrens, it would not starve. It would find food. The habitat is not the problem. The habitat is waiting, which forces a much sharper question than who killed them a century ago. If the door is standing open and the room behind it is furnished, why has nothing walked back in? That question is where the word hunting turns over the second time, and this is the turn people refuse to accept, because the thing doing the hunting now has no body at all. To see it, you have to understand how a large predator actually returns to ground it was erased from, because it does happen, and we have watched it happen. Black bears came back into the Ozarks after animals were released there in the middle of the last century, spreading out from that seed. Gray wolves pushed out of a protected core and recolonized the western Great Lakes, filling in Wisconsin and eventually the upper peninsula of Michigan on their own 4 feet. Even grizzlies have done it, expanding across the northern barrens where a source population sat right next to the empty ground. The pattern underneath all of these is the same, and it is simple. A bear leaves a full range and walks into an empty one that touches it. Bear meets bear. Bear breeds bear. The range fills. It only works when the distance between the full country and the empty country is short enough that a wandering animal actually arrives, and arrives to find another of its kind waiting. Now measure that distance for the Ungava grizzly and the trap comes into focus. Between the living western grizzlies and the empty eastern range lies well over 1,000 miles of ground that stopped working for great bears a long time ago. Highways laid across Ontario, cities, railways. Farmland where boreal forest used to stand. Corridors long since emptied of the wildlife that once bridged them. A grizzly setting out east from the western range is not crossing wilderness. It is crossing a slow, grinding gauntlet. And the same arithmetic that killed the eastern bear the first time, small numbers, high mortality, no one to breed with, closes in on that single traveler long before it ever reaches Quebec. But the killing detail, the one that seals the door, is written into the biology of the animal itself. Male grizzlies wander. Young males strike out and cover enormous distances looking for territory. Females do not. A female grizzly stays close to the ground where her mother raised her, generation after generation, almost never making the long dispersal at all. Follow that to its end. Even if one determined young male somehow ran the whole gauntlet, survived the highways and the hunted out land and the 1,000+ miles, and stepped at last onto the empty Ungava Barrens, there would be no female there to meet him. There never could be. A lone male at the end of an impossible journey is not the start of a population. He is a dead end with a heartbeat. The distance does not just make return hard, it makes return biologically impossible, and it does it silently, out on ground no one is watching. That is the predator, not teeth, not claws, a continent's worth of geography that eats every attempt before it can begin. So come back to that biologist folder, the one filling up a little every year, and the calls we started with. Some of those sightings resolve into ordinary things. A large cinnamon-phased black bear, the reddish-brown kind, can look enormous on a slope with bad light, and nothing beside it to judge size against, and it flatters itself in the retelling until it becomes a grizzly in the caller's memory. Some resolve into genuinely huge black bears because a well-fed male in good eastern forest gets very large indeed, and some never resolve at all. No hair snagged on a branch, no track pressed in mud, no second camera frame to confirm the first, just a report and a landscape extraordinarily good at swallowing evidence before anyone can reach it. The Ungava Peninsula alone runs to more than 500,000 square kilometers, and across almost all of it there is no camera, no researcher, and no earthly reason for anyone to be out there looking. And that is the part that should keep you up, more than any bear, not the animal. The idea that a whole population can be real and walking and gone, and the official record never even noticed until a skull fell out of the dirt by accident. The map of what lives around us is not carved in stone. It is written after the fact, when something is confirmed, or when it never is. Absence in the file does not prove absence on the land. It only proves that no one was standing there with the right thing in their hands at the right moment. So ask yourself what else the map is quietly wrong about in the country behind your own town right now. That is the true shape of what people cannot let themselves see. It is not in the end that they refuse to believe a grizzly could stand in a Quebec yard. It is stranger than that. Canada looked straight at its own eastern grizzly, held the bone, read the ledgers, heard the elders, and did the one thing that let everybody move on. It wrote the animal down as finished and closed the book. A population, though, is not a species. A skull is not a survivor. The western grizzlies are alive by the tens of thousands, and the door to the east stands open onto furnished, waiting country, and the only thing keeping the two apart is a distance no bear can cross, and a biology that will not let a female try. What hunted the grizzlies of Quebec was never a monster in the dark. It was a market, then a memory, then the map itself, and the map is still hunting them. It closes the same trap on every animal that might come home, before that animal has taken 100 steps. Somewhere in the western range this spring, a young male grizzly will leave his mother's country and start walking, the way young males always do. The drawer in the museum keeps the small, worn skull and keeps its silence, and the empty forest to the east goes on waiting, the way it has waited since long before anyone was here to call it empty.